Thank you so much, Ruchi. Welcome, everyone. So, our first speaker is Dr. David Coyle, who is an associate professor in the Department of Forestry and Environmental Conservation at Clemson University. He grew up on a farm in southeastern Minnesota and completed his BA in biology at Luther College, master's in entomology and forestry at Iowa State University, and a doctoral degree in entomology at the University of Wisconsin. His extension and research program focuses on forest and tree health and invasive species management in natural and managed landscapes across Southeast. And he creates education materials for professionals and non-professionals in everything from invasive plants to native and invasive outer plants. Welcome, Dr. Coyle. The floor is yours.
No, thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone, and welcome. Good day. Let's get, please current share. All right. Today, we are going to talk about pests of landscape trees. Most of these are going to be common, a few uncommon ones. Most of these we'll have here in parts of the Southeast. So let's dive in, shall we? I've been doing this for a while, and so I've got some opinions, and you're going to hear some of those opinions. But when you do, I'll be sure to let you know it's an opinion, not based on fact. So the first thing I want everyone to get across is that when we talk about invasive versus native pests, the invasive pests are primary, meaning those are going to be ones that are going to kill healthy live plants. For a true invasive pest, it typically does not matter how healthy that plant is, it's susceptible to that pest. On the other hand, almost every native pest we have that we deal with trees is going to be secondary. Okay, and secondary pests are simply responding to stress in trees. Now, stress comes in lots of different ways, right? It can be, and we'll talk about some of these ways, but the underlying issue with most of the native pests we have is stressed trees. I'll give you an example. This is bald cypress. It's very, very commonly planted urban tree. It's planted all over, but this is its native habitat, right? So this is where bald cypress is most happy. That is a nice swamp covered in plants, and there's alligators swimming around. But as people, as land managers, a lot of times this is where we shove a bald cypress into the ground. Okay, so this looks nothing like the previous slide. Because of that, it's susceptible to a lot of different things, many of them environmental, but also quite a few management issues. Extreme temperatures can hurt trees. So this is when we had a really late frost a few years ago. This is the oak tree in my yard here in Georgia. You see a lot of these leaves were burned kind of at the tips. No real overall damage to the tree, but it is a stressor. So we'll talk about these stressors, and think of stressors as sort of straws on a camel's back. At some point, enough stressors are really going to hinder that tree's ability to protect itself. There's the drought monitor, and hopefully most of us are familiar with the drought monitor. Yes, there are some issues with how drought is measured and all of that stuff, but at the end of the day, this does a pretty good job of letting us know, at least on a state and a county-wide basis, how dry is it outside, right? That's what this whole map is sort of telling you. The more red it is, the more dry it is. If it's white, that means we're doing pretty good in terms of moisture. Now, a lot of our plants we have in municipal areas are not surrounded by green, and so we have this urban heat island effect. And this is something we'll talk about. This is Washington, D.C. Okay, so I want you to pay attention to these green spots here. So these are parks, waterways, places that are a little more natural compared to everything else. Here's the heart of DC, the Capitol's in there, Senate building, Supreme Court, all of that. When you look at a map of this same area, looking at how hot it is and what are the surface temperatures, this is what you end up getting. And so you end up getting blue, which is cooler. That is where all those plants were growing. And red, which is warmer, is where you have just a complete, it's almost completely concrete for some of those areas, right? So where you have all this concrete, you have a lot more heat. And even though there's lots of concrete there, we know there are trees planted on the side of the road, in parking lots, all that type of thing. So the whole point is these trees in a lot of these areas where it's very, very city and very, very concrete, they are getting bombarded with lots of heat. and lots of conditions their native congeners are not getting out in the wild. And so what does this mean? Well, there's a lot of people have done a lot of big research, and I'll boil it down into three main things. Right? So when it gets warmer, a tree loses more water at night from its leaves. Okay. It also means that when it's super hot, photosynthesis decreases, and this is the process by which trees make food. And then when it's hot, they can't store as much food. Okay, so the whole process of trees and green plants, right? They're taking sunlight and they're taking CO2 and they're photosynthesizing and making food and shoving it down to the roots, kind of like stocking the pantry. Well, more or less, think of it this way. When it's really warm, they're not doing that as efficiently and they're not doing that as well. So you have sort of this perpetually stressed tree just from the environment it's in. Now, on top of that, there are things like this that happen, volcano mulch. And if you take one thing away from anything I say today, it's please don't do this. All this is doing, I know some people do this because they think it looks great, but all this is doing is creating a moist habitat that's perfect for fungi to grow on at the base of that tree, and it's going to be the cause of all sorts of issues later. On the opposite end of that is this, soil compaction. And we see this so often in parking lots, especially where people are driving or walking all over these. This is why, and a couple more areas. So you've got these exposed roots. Again, this is why we really stress a good mulch ring around the drip line. Match the drip line of that tree, couple inches. That's all you got to do. It's going to keep moisture in. And more importantly, it's probably going to keep people away from it. Okay, this is what I like to call affectionately weed eater blight. And it's when people with weed eaters and lawnmowers run into the trunk of these trees. Every time there's something that runs into the trunk of the tree, it's creating an open wound. And that goes for weed eaters, that goes for lawnmowers. So as a guy with a lot of teenagers in the neighborhood, I've seen how they mow the lawn and they're not even looking as they mow. So every time you scalp those big roots with the lawnmower, you're just opening up a wound for potential fungi to get in there. And at the end of the day, people are kind of one of our root causes. And I'll use a quote from my friend Tony Tidwell of Clemson, who said, "Our biggest threat to urban tree health is 18 to 22-year-old males on Saturdays in the fall." I'm sure this tracks for basically every place with a large football team or every place with a large group of young adults. People make poor choices after long days in the sun. And just, at some point, physical barriers might be the way to do it. And we've put these up in Clemson, and these are about 5 feet tall. They just keep people off that trunk, and it's actually shown to be pretty effective in just keeping people off of the trees. That said, they don't last forever. Okay, so this is not one of ours from Clemson, thankfully. But, if you're going to put up these barriers, we have to be mindful that at some point the tree is going to outgrow those. And then there's, leaving things like these support straps on, right? They serve a purpose, sure, but at some point they have got to come off of there. So at the end of the day, a lot of the stress that happens to trees, it's either environmental or it's from people. And all these stress factors tend to accumulate and sort of work with each other to make them susceptible to all these different pests. And now we're going to talk about some of these pests. So let's start with common defoliators. There's lots of different defoliators that we have on southern hardwoods, lots of them. Almost every one of them is a secondary pest, okay? But here are some of the most common. First is the forest tent caterpillar. It does not make a tent, much to its name's chagrin. It's native to the U.S. You get a generation a year. I typically see the young ones in like May, June, and then they'll be there for a little bit in the summer. They have a pretty standard, what I call a standard butterfly moth life cycle, right? So they have these egg masses that overwinter, and you can see these on twigs. They look like little barrels of eggs on these twigs. They're about a ½ inch long, 3/4 inch long or so. The eggs hatch, and then the larvae will eat, and they will feed together. That's called feeding gregariously. At some point, they finish feeding, and they make these loose cocoons. They turn into a little brown moth. So outbreaks are cyclical. The forest tent caterpillar is one of those native pests that goes through outbreaks. So the populations go up and they go down and up and down. And these usually don't kill a tree, these outbreaks. A tree can handle 1, 2, even 3 years of full defoliation because of the reserves it has in its roots. Now, not every tree can do that. Recently transplanted trees in roadways and medians or places like that are much more susceptible, but they can handle a lot more defoliation than you think they can. One thing about these outbreaks, though, they're a massive nuisance. And if you look on this house, there's all the little white spots on the siding. Those are all cocoons from forest tent caterpillars just covering this. And if you live in the Savannah area, Georgia, or the low country of South Carolina, you are probably well aware that the last 3 years, we have had a major forest tent caterpillar outbreak down there in the, I guess, the Beaufort-Savannah type area, where we have billions of these things all over the place. And so Dave Jenkins from the commission has sent some pictures. These were all submitted. This is just, the sheer number of them is amazing. And now I know I said they don't make a tent, but they will drag a silk line kind of after them. So when you have these big outbreaks, they put the silk kind of everywhere. And they're hardwood feeders. They don't feed on pine, which is really cool, because then when you get these aerial shots, you can see exactly what they have been eating. So all the light areas are completely defoliated. Hardwoods, all those dark green areas, those are your southern pines down there in the low country. And you'll see they will completely defoliate trees all the way down to the petioles. And one of my favorite pictures is this one, where you can see they are marching across this sweet gum plantation, going from left to right, and they're just kind of moving their way through. So this is one of the probably more common cyclical outbreak defoliators we have in South Carolina, throughout the Southeast, honestly. Its close cousin, the eastern tent caterpillar, is likely quite familiar as well. This is the one that does make a tent, and it makes those tents in the branch crotches of cherry trees, often right away in the spring. Sort of right as these are leafing out, you'll see these tents. Almost the exact same life cycle. You've got those little egg barrel masses, and then they hatch and they feed. The big difference is that the eastern tent caterpillar has that white line on it. Forest tent caterpillar has what looks like little white boot prints, and then you've got tent and no tent. Eastern tent caterpillars are fully capable of defoliating entire trees, but we've never seen them defoliate large acreages like you do with that forest tent caterpillar. The webworm, fall webworm, is another very common defoliator we're probably all familiar with. 2 to 3 generations a year, there's spring webworms, fall webworms. These are native little white moth, and what we probably notice most about the fall webworm is those webs. Super common July, August, September in this part of the world. They will start smallish. They actually start just with one leaf, where they'll wrap it up and feed in there. Eventually, they will take over a branch. In some cases, they can take over the entire tree. And then often we see something that looks like this, a tree that just has all these webs kind of all over the end of the branches. Now, we typically don't require management. This is not going to hurt a tree. It's unsightly. Most people would think it's unsightly, but it's not really detrimental, because in the overall scheme of things, it's not taking a whole lot of that foliage away from the tree. Please don't set it on fire. You may or may not be surprised to know of how many people have said, is it best just to set these on fire? And my standard company policy is, please don't set trees on fire, especially if they're close to your house. It seems a bit ridiculous to say, but again, please don't do that. If you want to get rid of these things, it's really simple. What that web does is it protects those caterpillars from all sorts of predators and birds. So if you can just take a stick and break open that web, wasps will get in there and birds will get in there, and those populations will be snuffed out almost within a week or so. It happens very, very quickly once that web is broken open. So that's probably the easiest way to get rid of those. Cankerworms are also very common. These are known as loopers or inchworms, since what we called them as a kid. They eat lots and lots of different things. In some places, they've got these repeated issues with them. Charlotte, North Carolina is one that has just sort of been fighting cankerworm outbreaks for what seems like decades at this point. Probably the really cool thing from an entomology perspective about these is that the females are flightless. So you'll see them there on the left. They have they're teeny tiny little vestigial wings, kind of like little wing nubs, but the eggs are on the branches, they hatch, they feed, they pupate in the soil, and the females will just crawl up the nearest tree, put out a pheromone, which is sort of an airborne chemical that calls in the males. The males that are little gray moths will fly mate, and she will lay eggs, and they will go from there. Cankerworms also very cyclical in terms of their outbreaks. So some years you might see a handful, other years you might have complete defoliation on some of your landscape trees and shrubs. Oakworms. Now we're getting to a couple, 3 species that are very common in July, August, September. They're kind of what I call the late season or summer defoliators, and oakworms is certainly one of them. The moths are actually pretty good size. They're a couple inches across, usually a reddish brown type color with kind of an orangish body, very fuzzy, very fuzzy. The caterpillars themselves have two little antenna looking things on them. They are gregarious, so you will see them together all the time, kind of striking a pose for you. And again, they can get up to about 2 inches long. These are probably most common. Well, obviously, they're most common on oaks, but we see them a lot in landscape trees, and they're very noticeable because they like to be on trees. It seems like they're in the open. And so you'll see them on the edge of a road, edge of a driveway, edge of the woods, or that landscape tree right in there. That's where they do a lot of their damage. Now, does it really harm the tree? Not very much, but yes, can be unsightly. Similar, you've got the yellow-necked caterpillar. These are very similar to oakworms, except they have a much wider range of hosts they'll feed on. Here you can see these little ones are feeding on oak. They'll also hit things like blueberries. And so this is on my blueberry bush in the yard. If you catch it early, you'll see a little brown leaf. And what happens there is those eggs, you can see it in the bottom left, the eggs hatch, the larvae fed, and because they're so tiny, they're not able to get all the way through the leaf on one bite. So they end up sort of just shaving off half of the leaf. They shave off sort of the half they're on. The rest stays brown and dries up. But eventually they do get big enough and they will defoliate branches or small trees and shrubs. They'll strike this typical U pose. This is to ward off predators. Anytime you disturb the branch, they will do that. They'll also get a little ball of spit will come up to their mouth. So if you ever disturb them, they'll all make that pose and a little ball of spit will come up there. The rosy maple moth is a beautiful moth. It's about 1.5 inches wide or so, and it's with its wings there. It's that bright pink and bright yellow. Feeds on maple. Again, same thing. They're going to be in areas where people see. A lot of people have maple trees in their yard, so there might be a branch or a half a tree or a small tree that's completely defoliated by these. But again, these defoliations do not do a whole lot of damage to the tree. And then finally, you've got your variable oak leaf caterpillar. These come in a lot of different colors. That's why they're variable oak leaf caterpillar. They're all going to hit oaks. The big characteristic is their head is kind of slanted back at about a 45-degree angle. Now, how do we manage these native caterpillars on hardwoods? Honestly, probably the easiest thing is to not bother because they're not going to really hurt your tree. Now, in some cases, they are going to be pretty pestiferous, especially if they're on a branch, maybe over your deck. You're going to have a lot of caterpillar frass dropping down. Frass is our fancy entomology word for poop, but you'll have that all over. But natural enemies are typically going to take care of these things, so you don't need to do a whole lot. If treatment is needed, some of the biorational insecticides like Bacillus thuringiensis, BT, work really well. Obviously, the non-selective stuff works too. Single tree controls, you could do tree bans. If you can see those egg masses, especially for the tent caterpillars, you can just physically remove them and they will be gone. But again, by and large, nothing is going to really happen to your tree. And there's a reason for that. The reason being, when you have late season defoliation, late summer defoliation, every tree, when it makes a leaf, that leaf has to basically pay for itself. So when the leaf comes out in the spring, it's used resources from the roots to create that leaf. That leaf has to be alive and be green and photosynthesize for a certain amount of time to make up the energy that was used to create it. By summertime, almost all those leaves have already paid for themselves and then some, right? They've already paid to stock the pantry, so to speak, which is the big roots. They've made extra food. So the tree is almost, think of it like the tree's gotten its use out of these leaves already. So losing it at that point is not nearly as detrimental as a spring defoliation when that leaf has just come up and used all those resources. So again, late summer defoliators, they're pretty noticeable, but from a tree perspective, there's not a whole lot of damage that's actually happening there. Bagworms are very common throughout the whole region. These things eat lots of stuff. I know we typically see them on things like junipers, arborvitae, and conifers. They will feed on hardwoods. There's a little caterpillar inside there. They're feeding and building that little bag out of whatever they're feeding on. The males and the females will be inside the bag, one of each. They'll pupate in the bag. Males will leave the bag. Females actually never leave the bag. She just pupates in there, and then she sort of chews a hole, opens it up for the male to mate with her. She lays her eggs in there. Pretty easy to manage these. Honestly, you can hand pick the bags is really the simplest thing to do. You just pick them off and destroy them. Spraying for these is tricky because you've got to get spray of the chemical on the foliage that the larvae are going to feed on. And if you don't do anything, they can be pretty detrimental. Right? I've seen them strip lots of different kind of things, whether it's shrubs, whether it's trees. Again, they will hit some of the hardwoods as well, but not nearly in the densities as we see them on things like arborvitae and some of those conifer bushes and that type of thing. One other defoliator of conifers is the sawflies, pine sawflies. And a lot of folks have pines in their yard or in their, as a central part of their landscape. Lots of different sawfly species here in the Southeast. Another typical, very standard eruptive herbivore to where the populations go up and they go down. Again, lots of different species. They look a lot different, but they all function kind of the same way. And so kind of our model sawfly is a red-headed pine sawfly. So you've got the adult in the upper left corner there. You've got the larvae. You've got those cocoons in the lower right. And then you see the eggs on the lower left. And then here's a little close-up of the eggs. So they're called sawflies because the adult's ovipositor, which is the little thing on the back end of her that she uses to shove the eggs into the plant, it kind of looks like a steak knife. So it's got these serrations. So that's why they call them sawflies. So she inserts her little steak knife ovipositor into that needle, and each one of those brownish areas is where an egg has been inserted. And then those eggs hatch, and then these little teeny tiny larvae, you can see two of them right in the middle there with the yellow bodies and black heads, will march up and down the leaves. They will chew, and then you will get different kinds of damage. So these sawflies are gregarious. They hang out together pretty much their whole life. The young larvae eat needles like an ear corn. Okay, and we talked earlier about with some of the caterpillars, how their jaws, their mandibles when young are not quite big enough to eat all the way through that leaf or all the way through that needle. So they're basically eating it like an ear of corn. That leaves that brown kind of wispy half needle sitting there. But then as they get bigger, they can eat the thing like a carrot. They'll just start on the top and they'll work their way down. And that's what gives you those needle nubs, which are so common. So this is very standard sawfly damage. You might see it just on a tree here or there. You see pine trees, sometimes they're shrubs, those mugo pines, but you've got either trees or shrubs that are pines. They'll be just really short little needles. It can be a problem, in larger areas. This is a spot over in Louisiana. They've had about 2 years of big pine sawfly outbreaks. And here you can see these pines that were in rows, every one of them mowed down, kind of opposite of the forest ant caterpillar. In this case, the bright green stuff is where the hardwoods are, where they still have leaves. The grayish brownish stuff is all the pines that have been defoliated. Management, again, we don't usually recommend control. They're rarely going to be that bad, especially in managed landscapes. They have to deal with them. Natural enemies are pretty good to take care of things. But, if you have a favorite tree or a favorite shrub with pine sawflies, you can physically remove them. In some cases, you can take that tree, that shrub, if it's small enough, and just shake it, and a lot of them will fall off. If there are people spraying them off with a strong hose, you could pay your kid a nickel a sawfly to pick them off. There's all sorts of things you can do to just physically remove them. But again, by and large, natural enemies are going to take care of those. Now we'll jump to ambrosia beetles. These are extremely common throughout the region. Everywhere you can think of, there are ambrosia beetles, and they're really diverse. They're really diverse in terms of how they look. One thing that's pretty consistent is their size. They're pretty darn small. And they do not actually feed on the green part of the tree or the shrub. So they make these fungal galleries. So the adults will chew their way into a weakened, a stressed tree. Fungal spores get off their body and they start growing. And then the larvae and the adults will feed on that fungus. So anyone that's seen these, we call these toothpicks or noodles or frass tubes. This is what an ambrosia beetle, one of the things it leaves, right? So each one of these is where an adult ambrosia beetle has gone in there. You can see it here too. It could be exposed roots. It could be, standing trees and hardwoods. Anywhere there's stress on a tree, these things will come. Pine trees are not without them as well. The difference is the ambrosia beetles on pine trees don't really leave those long noodles. They leave what looks like a really fine flour. It's super powdery, super fine. It just sort of drops down at the edge of the tree. Couple ambrosia beetles we'll talk about real quick here. The black twig borer, which is common throughout the region. Super, super small. you can see it leaves this branch flagging, and that's what it's most known for, is this branch flagging. Not really a problem for established plants, something that might have just been planted, you might have some issues, but by and large, it's an aesthetic thing, and they seem to love magnolias for some reason. They really like those magnolias, so you'll see these brown branches, and if you look really closely, you can see a teeny tiny hole there, and that's where that adult bored their way in, and then they just go straight up the twig, which ends up killing it. You can physically cut them out. There's not really any good management you can do once they're in there, though, because you can't spray anything on them. And, we notice these because the attacks are closer to the ground. So the attacks are kind of usually right where your eye line happens, unfortunately. One of the worst ambrosia beetles we have is an invasive species, though. That is the red bay ambrosia beetle, which transmits Laurel wilt. This came about just over 20 years ago. We found it here. Again, standard ambrosia beetle life cycle. They're boring into trees. They're cultivating that fungus. They're feeding on that. And you've got that fungal staining as that fungus clogs up the vessels in that tree. Anything in the family Lauraceae is a possible host. This is all your red bays down on the coast, but also sassafras as you get to the upper part of our region. Red bays are sort of known for holding on to those dead leaves. So we always say that you never really knew how many red bays were out there till they were all dead and brown. And then holy cow, there was a lot of them at one point. And now we've got laurel wilt throughout the whole coastal plain, working its way up into those areas where there's more sassafras and some of those other host species. Not a lot for management you can do. Chip a tree up, cut it down. There's really no physical protection that works. Fungicides will work. You can inject your tree with something like propiconazole, but it's not cheap. It's got to be done every year. Yes, insecticides will kill them, but again, they're flying practically year-round, especially down in the coastal plain. So it really is not really worth your time or effort to try to kill the adults themselves. Your best effort, if you've got a tree in the Lauraceae family you want to save, is probably a fungicide injection. And then we have bark beetles. So most of these in North America are going to be native. Most of them attack stressed trees. We've got one exception here in the Southeast, and that is the southern pine beetle. So in this case, the feeding consumes that green, that phloem, right? And southern pine beetle is probably our number one tree killer we have. It's part of this Dendroctonus group, but southern pine beetle is the one that we've spent a lot of time on, especially in production areas, but also in urban areas, because it doesn't really care where you have your pine tree. As we see on this map, this is one of my most enjoyable risk maps, because the risk of southern pine beetle is there if a pine tree grows there. So they're kind of all over the place. A good way to tell if you have southern pine beetle is if your pine is dropping green needles. That is a dead giveaway for SPB. It's the only beetle that will make a pine drop a green needle. And then you'll get, as the trees get attacked, you have these pitch tubes. They're typically right in the cracks of the bark, where you've got plates, which is the flat part, or cracks, which is kind of between those. The adults drill in, and they will have an S-shaped, wavy S-shaped gallery. I just happened to catch this one, a perfect S. This is where she went in, and this is where she's chewing her way up right now. She will lay eggs all along that gallery, and then those larvae will feed and kind of go perpendicular to the gallery. So when at the end of the day, when all is said and done, you've got these wavy galleries going back and forth. The larvae feed, and you see them here on the right. They feed on one end, so they're eating up here, and they're kind of pooping on the other, which is why you've got that brown frass packed in the gallery behind them. Blue stain fungi comes in, and then when those beetles have left, remember, when they go in the tree, it's trying to fight them off. So it puts out the pitch, and you get those pitch tubes. But after they've left, after they've sort of defeated the tree, think of it as a battle, you don't have any pitch tubes. It just looks like it was shot with a bird shotgun, right? You just got these little holes all over the place. Ips are another super common bark beetle we have down here on pines, and these things are all over everywhere. They are similar to southern pine beetles, but just not as aggressive, right? So ips are going to be something that always attacks stressed trees, regardless of where that stress comes from. Maybe it's just a branch that isn't as healthy as it could be. They'll attack that. They could attack this branch, a branch that breaks. This was here at the UGA Warnell Whitehall Forest, where this slash pine branch had broken off in the storm. Ips all over the branch. The rest of the trees perfectly healthy and perfectly fine. So again, ips are not all that aggressive. It's very unlike southern pine beetle to where then they get going, outbreaks happen. They just mow everything down regardless of how healthy it is. Ips trees are a little different. With southern pine beetle, the whole tree color changes kind of at once. With ips, you'll have a splotchy looking tree where part of it, maybe it's a branch, maybe it's the top, will change color, and the rest looks okay. You've got pitch tubes that go vertically up and down the stem, and then you've got the frass coming out of there as well. Ips love the heat, so you'll have lots and lots of generations, especially during the heat of the summer here in the Southeast. If it makes a tree stressed, it increases susceptibility to ips. That could be from abiotic, biotic, human, fire, mechanical, it doesn't matter. If that pine tree is stressed, it's going to increase susceptibility to ips. And you can see ips have like spotty looking damage. If you look at it aerially, so you see a few trees here and there. If you remember that shot we saw earlier of southern pine beetle, that was very much a big group of trees all at once. And so sometimes, though, you got to check the ground because this can look like a southern pine beetle spot with your dead ones in the middle. But we go on the ground and this is what we see. And hopefully you see that big, long white line on that middle tree right there. That's because it was a lightning strike, a really bad lightning strike that then got into the root grafts and sort of fried everything. And you see those that bunch of dust at the base of every tree. That's because these trees were stressed so bad from lightning, and energy beetles got in and just sort of created that spot. And then finally, turpentine beetles. This is our other Dendroctonus, related to southern pine beetle, but much, much less aggressive. These typically sit on the bottom 10 feet or so of the tree, great big pitch tubes. They're just kind of, happy to be there is how I look at it. You'll see them on wounds, you'll see them on cankers. They create what I call pitch BBs, which is little round BB-sized balls of pitch with that tree. Now, I talked earlier about stress in trees and how stress kind of is the whole factor for all this. So as an example, we had these trees at the Savannah River site, which is just across the river from Augusta, Georgia in South Carolina. Perfectly healthy 13-year-old loblollies, but I baited them with a bunch of chemicals that made it smell like it was an outbreak of beetles, right? So all the beetles thought, hey, it's an outbreak. And then I looked to see what would happen as these beetles came. And here's what we found. The first beetles that came had this huge pitch response from the tree. Because remember, these trees are perfectly healthy. They'd been watered, they'd been fertilized, they'd been babied their whole life. So the first beetles that tried to attack these healthy trees got completely killed and just absorbed in this pitch, and they died. Well, as more beetles came, then you see a little smaller pitch response. And if you look carefully, there's a little black hole because that beetle got in. So it had a fight, but it made it in. And then as beetles came later, you see there's barely any pitch response. So this just shows that if you have a healthy tree, pine is this example, hardwood same way. Healthy trees can fight off a lot of the pests that try to attack them. It's when they get weak and stressed that they become susceptible. And once, for pines especially, you get these weak and stressed pines, you get these secondary things. So if anyone has ever walked by a pine tree in the woods or in the yard and it looks sick and you hear this crunching, this crunch, that's these. This is your pine sawyer. So this is a type of beetle that comes late to the party. It's one of the last things there. These large larvae, they can be an inch and a half long. They are just chewing their way through what's left of the phloem and what's left of, underneath the bark. This is what the adult does. It makes these sort of little cones into the bark where they chew. She'll turn around and she'll lay her egg. And you can see one here next to an Ips pitch tube on that flat part of the plate. Again, these larvae are large-ish, inch and a half or so long. They leave these big wood shavings everywhere. And at the end of the day, for bark beetles, hardwoods or pines, the big thing is to keep trees healthy. And that's going to really take care of most of the issues, right? We hear a lot, well, what about chemical treatments? Yeah, the chemicals will kill a beetle, but it's really hard to get some of these because if you've got a lot of these secondary bark beetles, a chemical is just a Band-Aid. There's something inherently wrong with the health of that tree that really should be figured out before you just start Band-Aiding things the whole time. All right, now we'll move on to some hardwood beetles. You've got these pressed today, the jewel beetles. We call these the flat-headed borers. If you've ever seen these, they can be, inch and a half long, but their heads are really flat. Probably our most famous example is the emerald ash borer, present in most of the states here in the Southeast. arguably the worst invasive species in forests that we have seen in this generation. I would say it probably is the worst invasive species of this generation. So life cycle, you'll see these adults will come out in, late spring or April, May for us, maybe early summer, depending on your perspective. They mate, they feed on the leaves a little bit, but this really isn't where the damage hits. The damage is from these eggs, which hatch, and then you've got these flat-headed borer larvae, which feed on the phloem, and their feeding can be devastating. They just meander all the way underneath that bark, pupate in the bark, and then this kills the tree. It prevents that tree from moving food in its tissues. It's basically all over Eastern North America at this point. I know Canada's not lit up, but it should be lit up here. What do you look for emerald ash borer? Well, you've got a declining and thinning crown. This is not a great characteristic, because this could also be drought or some other type of damage. But one of the other things we typically see then is these epicormic sprouts. So if you see an ash tree, and it's always going to be an ash tree for emerald ash borer, once you get this epicormic sprouting, this is basically the soul of the tree leaving. Okay, this is a friend of mine, Stephen Pullman, gave it that name. I love it. The soul of the tree escapes through these epicormic sprouts, because that's really all you've got here. The management in this case is to cut that thing off at the ground and put something else in there, because this tree is not going to survive. Bark will crack where you've got the damage underneath there, and then you have these D-shaped exit holes, always shaped like a D. And then again, you've got the winding galleries. It'll just eat up every bit of phloem underneath there. When you're looking kind of at several feet back, sometimes you'll see what looks like different colored bark. Actually, blonding is what it's called. And this is from woodpeckers chipping away at that bark, trying to get, and squirrels too, I should say, trying to get at the larvae underneath there. Now, when EAB first hit, we thought it was a lost cause. There was no saving it. We know this is not the case. You can save an ash tree now, provided it's got about less than 30% defoliation. If it has over 30% defoliation, is it dead? Maybe not, right? Never say never, but boy, that's an uphill battle to save something that's lost more than 30% of its canopy to EAB. Part of the problem is these trees are all infested right now, but it just looks good because it's just starting. A lot of times by the time we see that, it's a bit too late, that type of thing. Lots of different chemical control options for EAB, injection, soil drench, trunk sprays. Emamectin benzoate is kind of your industry standard at this point. And there's a whole book out there on what to do for EAB. So if any of y'all have to deal with this would be the thing to get and to flip through that a little bit. Now we've got cerambicids, some longhorn beetles. These are round-headed borers, so these can be just as long as flat-headed, but they're a lot thicker and chunkier. Some are about the size of your pinky. They can be quite large. The main one we're dealing with in the southeast right now is this one, the Asian longhorn beetle. Wide host range. The beetles are pretty good size. You can see one in my hand there, inch and a half long, antennae. They look like several other things we have. We've got those eyed click beetles and cottonwood borers, and the monocamus, which we talked about earlier, the pine sawyers, can be confused. But Asian longhorn beetles are black, deep, dark, shiny black with these bright white spots. The females and males, little different size, but they behave kind of like the pine sawyers. So the female will chew these pits in the tree, and she likes maples in this part of the world. 98% of what we see them on is some sort of maple, mostly red maple, but there's also a little bit of, some of those other things out there in the swamps or in the landscapes. She'll put these egg niches kind of all up and down the tree, and then after those eggs hatch, the larvae start feeding on the phloem. This causes this bleeding, this really dark bleeding, makes it pretty easy to see at this point. As the larvae get larger, they turn and go into the wood, into the heartwood of the tree, and they kick out this sawdust and this frass and these shavings. And then this is where the damage happens, right? So they're Swiss cheesing the inside of that tree stem, the inside of these branches, and that is causing branch breaking and branch falling. So here is that branch in my hand. You can see it on the left. It's a pretty decent sized branch. And if you look head on, all of these are galleries made by Asian longhorn beetle larvae. So when these things do get somewhere, and so we've got a population down in Charleston County, South Carolina. When you have these in urban areas or where people live in neighborhoods and parks, it's very dangerous. I mean, you can't have things this big just falling out of the sky, out of the tree. And that is what happens as these things feed. Anytime it gets a little windy, stuff breaks off and drops. Adults will make this perfectly round exit hole when they leave. and then they will go complete the cycle and go again. So if you think you've seen an Asian longhorn beetle, we encourage you, please report that to regulatory. We've got a program in South Carolina, but if you think you've seen one, whatever state you're in, report it to your regulatory folks. There's also some wood boring Lepidoptera. These are again very secondary, very weak things. Clearwing moths. Here is again the soul of the tree escaping, right? That means this tree is about to die. And so you've got these stressed trees on this little thin median strip. If you look closely, one of the cool characteristics of those clearwing borers is that they leave a pupal case hanging out of the stem where they have left. Okay, so that's a good giveaway for those. And then you've got wood wasps. There's lots of different wood wasps out there. Trumex columba is the one that's most common with hardwoods. Again, they're a secondary thing. So if you have these, those are going to be because that tree is already weak. Again, for wood borer management, chemical treatments will kill the insect, but they're really hard to get at. Okay, so, and because these are all secondary, if you've got them, there's a problem with that tree's health, and that's really what needs to be addressed. All right, we'll talk about crepe myrtle's bark scale a little bit here. So this was first found about 20 years ago now, native to Asia. Tax crepe myrtles, as you might guess, you have really high population potential on some of these things. And the feeding scales are kind of like a straw. So they'll suck the fluid out of the tree on one end, and they'll poop out essentially sugar water on the other end. When that gets all over stuff, you have this mold that grows, this black sooty mold that will grow and discolor everything. Look, the life cycle is complicated. You probably don't need to know this, but what you do need to know is that if you squish one of these things, so you can see they're little white, and if you squish one, it's got a bright pink innards, right? So that's if you have a white scale looking thing on a crepe myrtle and you can squish it and you get bright pink, that's going to be crepe myrtle bark scale. They're pretty much all over the Southeast. They're filling in. I know this map is not entirely accurate, but this gives you an idea of how widespread they are already. Management wise, the best thing you can do is prevention. So don't purchase or plant infested plants. Diversify plantings. I know some municipalities love to have rows and rows and rows of crepe myrtles, but diversity is good for any pest management thing. There's not too many natural enemies. We're working on that a little bit right now. There's lots of chemical management that can be done. Foliar sprays need to be timed to get that crawler stage, because once they settle down and kind of make that white protective cap, they're pretty tough to get. And there's lots of soil applied systemics that work very well. New to Georgia, and not new to the region, but new to Georgia, spotted lanternfly. So this is a big pest of fruit trees and shrubs. Here you see some of the nymphs and the adult. They get up to be about a half-inch long or so. And then here's your current map. So we first found these in Pennsylvania a few years ago, and they're sort of slowly expanding their range outside there. It's kind of like a big leafhopper in that when the eggs hatch, they look similar-ish to an adult. They're black and white for a while. They get their red color, and eventually will get their leaves. And we see super high populations for these things. The love tree of heaven, I know that's an invasive tree. No, there's never going to be enough spotted lanternfly to control your tree of heaven. It's just a host they tend to like, but they will feed, again, over 100 different hosts in landscapes, woody, non-woody, even grasses in some cases. So they're very, very prolificous. Elm zigzag sawfly is also kind of one of our newer invasives we have. It's now found in several places in North America. Any elm is a host. Here's your current map. So we've got them in North Carolina, Virginia, and the Southeast, and then in the Midwest and the Northeast. Pretty distinctive feeding. When the eggs hatch that are laid on the side of those leaves, they make these zigzag patterns as they start to feed in. So each one of these has a little larva at the base of it there. So that's a really good indicator. You can see they're capable of really impressive defoliation. So here's your almost a mature elm tree, almost completely defoliated. So one of these things, if you see it, we ask you to report it. If you've got an elm that's got some defoliation, please report it. And I know this next one is not a tree pest, but I feel compelled to talk about the Joro spider, right? So we've been inundated with this thing for several years now. Native to Asia, here it is on my hand. You can see they get fairly good size. It's similar to the banana spider, which we have down on the coast. Difference being the banana spider has those fuzzy little leg warmer looking things on it. Similar to the garden spider. Garden spider doesn't have the black and yellow legs, and they sit a little bit different. Plus the garden spider web has that white filamentum right down the, or stimulamentum right down the middle of the web. The range is expanding. There's a website here to encourage you to go on to check out that range, and we've done some modeling. It's probably going to keep expanding. I know these things pop up in the news every so often. But yes, we're probably, if you don't have Joro spiders yet, you are probably going to get them as the take home there. I've heard some people say this is good news because they're going to feed on things we don't like. I think this is a subjective thing depending on your point of view, right? It's favorite cartoons. This is what the baby sees, right? Just a bunch of butts walking around. So is it good or not? That depends on your perspective. Mine, as a pest manager and ecologist, I don't think it's going to be good. We've done surveys and you see that where Joros are, they just take over pretty much everything, and you don't find any of the natives. All you find are Joros. So I think, at this point, this is not a great thing we have. And if we do see those, I would encourage you to report them to iNaturalist to help us with some of our research. With that, there's a few minutes left, and I am happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Coyle. So this is the time for questions. If you have any questions, we have a Q&A box here. I would just say, go ahead and type your question, and I can read out to Dr. Coyle. Maybe a couple of minutes for this gather their thoughts and come up with a question. Okay, we have a question now. Is there any way to prevent Joro spiders?
To prevent Joro spiders? No. If they're not already there, they're gonna get there at some point. And I'm sure they tend to like houses and structures, so that's why we see them so often, because they'll be on your deck, your carport, your porch, and all that. You can remove those easy enough. But in terms of, can you prevent them on a large scale? Probably not. Can you keep them out of your yard? I mean, I guess everyone needs a hobby. So if you just repeatedly got rid of the ones in your yard, maybe. But once they get to a place, in general, they're going to be there to stay.
Since you're waiting for the questions, I can ask a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about elm zigzag Sawfly. What is your kind of prognosis? It's going to come in southern states. What do you think?
I think it'll eventually keep spreading, but I also don't think we have a lot of elm overall, to where we don't have like elm stands where it's going to wipe out an elm stand, right? You're going to have an elm tree that gets defoliated here and there. These are pretty easily managed with pesticides. I don't know if there's any like natural enemies. I think they're still working on that, but it's a manageable thing that's probably going to hit elms in some of the urban areas, but that's kind of about all we can do. It may or may not get here. It all depends on how close those hosts are together.
I see a question here. So what is a pest that has been invading the newly planted pines, recommending longer interval for replant after harvest? Do you know what it is?
Oh, for pines. So when you replant pines, you've got a couple things. You've got those regeneration weevils, and then also Nantucket pine tip moth. They sell seedlings now. If you're talking about planting on a large scale, seedlings that are pre-treated with insecticide. And honestly, it's worth, they're only a few cents more a seedling. It's worth doing that because that buys you a year or two. If you don't do that, we typically say, from a forestry perspective, give it 6 to 8 months after harvest before you replant. And this just gives some time for natural enemies and for some of that, those roots and stuff that are left to degrade a little bit. But, in terms of preventing pests on newly planted pine, the easiest thing to do is probably get pre-treated seedlings. Yeah.
Another question now. So how concerned are you about the impact of spotted lanternflies when they reach in the Southeast?
Well, they have reached the Southeast, right? We've got that population in, what is it? Right down there in Atlanta now, I think, isn't it? Somewhere? Yeah, I forget which county, Forsyth or something. But here's my take on them. They're super annoying, right? And I think they're a bigger issue for some of the vineyards and stuff, of which we don't have a lot of, for being honest. There might be a few specialty vineyards here and there, but where lanternflies are, they're going to be really annoying because their populations are high. They walk all over the place. They get on everything. They will probably hammer a lot of people's gardens and some of the yard trees and that type of thing. So that being said, there's a bunch of stuff you can kill them. They're not Superman by any means, right? I mean, you can get rid of these things. It's just gonna, if it's unfortunate enough to where you get them on your property, it's gonna take some effort to get rid of them, but it's not like you can't get rid of them. Frankly, this was inevitable. They were always gonna, I think they were always gonna get down here as quickly as they spread from that first point in Pennsylvania when they found them, and they threw the kitchen sink at those things and couldn't stop it, right? And I know other states that have found it, they're like, oh, we only have one population. We're going to throw everything at it. We're going to eradicate it. Short of an actual fire, I don't think these are eradicatable. And I think that, you know, they usually get found where there's people. So clearly you're not going to start a fire in the middle of, you know, wherever, right? So it's something we just have to deal with, sadly.
Thanks. So there's one last question you do, okay, for the time. So what's the Crape Myrtle bark scale? This is on that. Will it need to be treated every year?
Yeah, I believe so. You know, and that, you know, you'd have to check on, if you use a systemic insecticide, you'd have to check the label and see if it works for more than a year or not. But my hunch is, and based on kind of experience, because we have such a long growing season, most of these things are going to be annual treatments. I don't know that, you know, because we have such that long growing season, I don't know that you're going to get a good systemic that lasts more than 1 year. Maybe you do. I'm not completely fluent in some of those systemic pesticides that are available, but that would be something to look on the label. But I would mentally prepare for, probably have to treat every year for those. Treatments do work though. I mean, that's the good news, right? You can treat and you can keep these things. Your crepe myrtles pretty much scale free. You just have to put the effort and time and money into it.
What about the biological control beneficials? Do you think they will be provide a good efficacy?
I mean, I've got a PhD student that's doing that exact thing. So we'll let you know in like 3 years. She's going to try and do some work with both ants and lacewings and see if that is something that might work. But we're kind of just diving into that. I mean, part of the problem with biological control with scales is there's so many different scale species out there. And if you don't have a biocontrol agent that is specific to crepe myrtle bark scale, they're just going to be out looking for scales in general, right? And so there's lots of different stuff to eat. What's to make them go eat the thing you want them to eat if there's stuff all over the place? And that's one of the challenges with biocontrol is getting something that's host specific enough to just focus on the pest du jour versus whatever scales are out there.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Coyle.
Yeah.
We enjoyed it. We learned a lot. Thank you.